When you're ready, Grant, the floor is yours.
Sure, go ahead.
Grant, would you like to start to present the series, the workshop?
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's great to see you here. My name is Grant Parker. I teach at Stanford University. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that Stanford University sits on the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. Together with Stefania Manfio of the Stanford Archaeology Center and supported by Stanford Global Studies, we've been hosting this seminar series called Reframing Enslaved Pasts. Today's talk will be the final in a series of 6. Today's topic brings us to the continental US. Previous installments have addressed the Senegal Liberations Project and the Indian Ocean. A quick word about the overall plan. We all know that big data approaches to the study of enslavement already boast many digital projects and websites, focusing mostly on the Atlantic world. The goal of our series has been to bring well-established projects into contact with newer ones, including our own. Presenters have been asked to address the following questions. What are the scholarly goals and opportunities driving your research project? What are the affordances and challenges involved in your chosen approach? And thirdly, how would you characterize your use of databases? With these questions, we have aimed to facilitate a discussion about critical data practices around enslaved pasts, focusing on methodologies. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say that several of us on this webinar, or rather Zoom room, have been involved in projects around the Indian Ocean labor diaspora, including the Cape of Good Hope, supported by CESTA, Stanford's Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. Several colleagues, Gerald Groenewald, Laura Mitchell, Kerry Ward, and Nigel Worden have led the way in this. The seminar series is funded by Stanford Global Studies, which aims to archive the talks for its YouTube channel. I hope each of you is okay with that. In general, we seek to engage not only scholars, but heritage practitioners working on histories and archaeologies of enslavement and other kinds of labor diaspora, and especially those comparing the Indian Ocean, Atlantic, and other systems. Those committed to public-facing humanities, those interested in digital humanities and critical data practices. I ask Stefania to introduce Alex and Greg, who will lead today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speakers, Professor Alex Burocki and Greg O'Malley. Alex Burocki is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine. He's the author of From Shipmates to Soldiers, Emerging Black Identities in the Rio de la Plata, and co-editor of From the Galleons to the Highlands, Slave Trade Routes in the Spanish Americans, and the Rio de la Plata from Colony to Nations, Commerce, Society, and Politics. Apart from the books and articles published in Argentina, Uruguay, Spain, and Brazil, he has published on the Africa diaspora in numerous journals. The next speaker from today is Professor Greg O'Malley. He's an Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His first book, Final Passage, The Intercolonial Slave Trade of British America, received 4 awards. And the project examines a complex network for distributing enslaved Africans through North America and the Caribbean after their survivals of the Atlantic crossing. And Professor O'Malley is currently writing a new book, The Escape of David George, An Odyssey of Slavery and Freedom in the Revolutionary Era. So Professor O'Malley and Brockie are the co-creator of the Intra-American Slave Trade database that is the topic of today's talk. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Professor Brockie and O'Malley. Thank you.
I think Alex and I decided I will go first. Thank you, Stefania, for that introduction, and to Grant and everyone else involved in organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be here virtually with you all. So we titled our presentation collectively the Intra-American Slave Trade Database, Potential and Limitations. I'm going to add the sort of 18th century or title, like 18th century novels often did for my half of this, which is or how I learned to stop worrying and compile a database. And so let me dive into that with the admission that I really did not want to count ships. I did not want to count the people on ships. I didn't want to do any kind of quantitative history at all. As a graduate student, I was seeking a dissertation topic with cultural history questions in mind. I was much more interested in studying something about the early encounters of European settlers and forced African settlers in colonial North America, how these people made sense of each other or failed to, how they borrowed from each other's cultures, how they created a new world together. Quantitative work sounded pretty uninspiring to me, if I'm honest, and yet here I sit, deeply involved in the Slave Voyages project as a co-editor of this Intra-American Slave Trade Database. It's a new addition to the Slave Voyages website. I'll just show it to you here very quickly. So we should now be seeing my screen here with the Slave Voyages website up. This menu across the top shows a few of your different main options. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database is, of course, the most famous and familiar to most users. It's been in some published format since 1999 and online since 2008. Our edition is this Intra-American database. And it documents and provides information about more than 27,000 slave trading voyages that moved enslaved people from one place in the Americas to another. What I really want to focus on today, though, although I'm happy to give more of a tour, and Alex is going to give a little bit more of a tour, I think, in his half as well during the Q&A, I want to reflect on the question of how has it come to this? how have I gotten here? And I hope you'll forgive me for doing a bit of that personal reflection on my own research trajectory, because I think it's actually useful for addressing those questions that Grant raised in terms of why do quantitative work? What are the goals of it? What are the potentials and limitations? Those kinds of questions. And the reason I think so is that in scholarship on the transatlantic portion of the slave trade, the field is mature enough that I think it's hard to imagine floundering in the dark as researchers. Most of us in this room embarked on our careers with a fair bit of the who, the what, where, and when of the transatlantic slave trade established by prior historians. Over the past couple of decades, scholars have refined and improved our understanding of the transatlantic slave trade in all kinds of important ways, with crucial insights emerging from scholars working from diverse methodological and theoretical approaches. But for most of us, for the past few decades, we've been able to take for granted the basic facts of the transatlantic forced migration, that something like 12.5 million people were forced into the deadly trade, that something like 10.5 million of them survived to settle in the Americas, that the vast majority of those survivors disembarked in Brazil or the Caribbean, that British and Portuguese traders carried the largest numbers of captives and hence secured the most profits. All of these sort of basic facts of the traffic were well known. So researchers entering academia in the last 2 decades or so could start from there, take that knowledge for granted. So I think it makes it hard to imagine not knowing. And this is where I think it might be instructive for me to reflect out loud on my own research trajectory a little bit, because studying the intercolonial slave trade of British America forced me very reluctantly not to take the basic questions of who, what, when, and where for granted. So I hope you'll bear with me as I explain a little bit about how I ended up doing a substantial amount of quantitative work despite my best intentions. And then I want to share some of the questions that my quantitative turn left unanswered, because I do think there are real limits to quantitative methodologies. But then I'll conclude by highlighting some arguments or conclusions from my research that don't seem quantitative on the surface, but which I might never have developed if not for the quantitative work I did do, raising some very puzzling and I think fairly important questions. So first I'll explain how I came to compile a database, and I'm going to switch to the time-lapse presentation of the data results here, just to give a visual. I think it helps capture some of the main patterns in the intra-American slave trade. Oops, that's actually not what I wanted to do. Let me switch to this tab. All right. So each of the dots on this map will represent a documented voyage in the database in an animated format. So when starting out as a graduate student, I was searching for a dissertation project on these cultural encounters between Africans and Europeans in North America. But one of the things that struck me repeatedly in the secondary literature was how often historians disaggregated European settlers to differentiate the British from the French, from the Dutch, or to distinguish Anglicans from Baptists, from Moravians. And yet historians talked a lot about Africans, as if Africa was uniform and all people from there could be generalized about. And I knew I wanted to approach this cultural encounter in the colonial Americas with more sensitivity to Africa's diversity and the specific cultures and particular enslaved people in different places. So I set about reading all that I could about the routes that moved people to different parts of the Americas to try to capture more of that specificity, to make sure I understood more about who specifically Africans were in specific times and places. But in reading books about various enslaved communities and in looking at the transatlantic slave trade database, it struck me that we actually had very limited information about who the enslaved people were in many places and about how they had ended up where they were. The colony of North Carolina offers a great example. A book that I read on slavery in colonial North Carolina taught me that there were nearly 100,000 enslaved women and men in North Carolina by the eve of the American Revolution. But the author said that they had also documented only one voyage to the colony directly from Africa. 100,000 people, one known voyage. So how did enslaved people get there? And where specifically and from what backgrounds did all these African people come? The authors offered some speculations in a paragraph with no footnotes. So about the third or fourth time I ran across this problem in the historiography of slavery in North America, but looking at different colonies, I realized that maybe the more useful contribution I could make was to investigate this problem impeding the research that I really wanted to do and study the patterns. How did people end up where they ended up? So after a bunch more reading, I cooked up a dissertation proposal to investigate the intercolonial slave trade of British America, with the hypothesis that only a massive dispersal slave trade after the Middle Passage could explain the Black populations of many colonies, and that this additional phase of the slave trade would have very important implications for understanding what African captives endured in the slave trade and the cultures that they created upon landing. My proposal then got constructive critique from several scholars who read it for me. My framing of the topic was too broad for a dissertation, they said, and I should pick a particular route of the slave trade or a particular port of the slave trade and study that. And that critique of my proposal was sort of the first nudge toward a database or toward more quantitative work, although I failed to recognize it at the time. And the reason I say that is because I had no basis on which to choose a particular route or a particular port to focus on. What were the major routes of the intercolonial slave trade? What were the major ports? I could make guesses, but no one really knew. So in consultation with my advisor, we agreed that I needed to cast a broader net, considering the whole of the British Americas. And if the topic turned out to be important, either I or other scholars could explore specific ports, routes, or other aspects of this traffic in more detail later. But I still resisted the suggestion to quantify the research at first. Inspired especially by Walter Johnson's Soul by Soul, I wanted to focus on the experience of captives, the meaning of this intercolonial traffic to both the enslaved and the traders. So I dug into papers that I hoped would be more descriptive, the papers of merchants organizing these ventures. And I started with Charleston, looking at guys like Henry Lawrence and John Garrard. And basically, I quickly got confused. I thought I was looking at Charleston for an outward traffic of recently arrived Africans forcibly transshipped from Charleston up and down the coast to places like North Carolina and Georgia. And I found some of that, but mostly these Charleston traders were supplementing the arrivals of people from Africa with still more arrivals of Africans from the Caribbean. Why were they competing with the direct trade from Africa with these indirect arrivals? How common was that? I was really disoriented. I couldn't contextualize any of the letters that I found about individual voyages. And more troubling, I realized that one of my first educated guesses about the routes and directions of this intercolonial slave trade was wrong. So which of my other hypotheses were wrong? At a fundamental and very literal level, I realized I didn't know what I was talking about. I didn't know what the intra-American slave trade was. So very reluctantly, I shifted my attention to port records and I began to count ships and the people that they carried. I looked at port records for every single British colony for which port records survived, both inbound and outbound, because I was increasingly convinced that my educated guesses about the patterns in this traffic were less educated and more guesses. Eventually, I had documented more than 7,000 voyages from British American ports to other colonies in British, French, and Spanish America. I'll start the time lapse again. And I was aware of the critiques of quantitative histories of the slave trade, at least some of them that were out then, more have come since. And those critiques haunted me, but I didn't know another way to get a grasp of the scope of my topic or its patterns. Compiling a database helped me establish the basic facts of my topic, to understand where people boarded vessels in the Americas and where those vessels took them. And I want to be very clear that I do not mean to suggest that such a database can answer all of our questions. It can tell us very little about shipboard conditions. It can tell us nothing about the thoughts and beliefs of the people on board. It tells us almost nothing about the mindsets of the perpetrators of the slave trade. There is a lot that a database of voyages simply can't do. I certainly never intended the Intra-American database to be the only tool anyone looked at to study the Intra-American slave trade. Even for my own book, I considered the database just one of 4 main types of source material that I used, alongside government reports on the slave trade from their oversight of it, traders' letters and accounts from organizing the trade, and enslaved people's rare narratives of their own experiences. Even more rare for this intra-American phase than for the transatlantic. I would encourage any historian using either database on slavevoyages.org to use it in conjunction with lots of other types of source material. And in fact, by sharing data publicly, I hope one of the things we're doing is freeing up other historians to look at more other types of source material, because they can rely on slave voyages for some of the basic facts of where and when ships carried enslaved people. So it's important to acknowledge that a database and quantitative approaches have serious limits. But I also want to suggest that quantitative methodologies often have uses beyond just answering obviously quantitative questions, like how many people moved from here to there. My biggest frustration in writing final passages was the inability to do more to recover enslaved people's voices, perspectives, and experiences. But on the flip side, the most rewarding part of the project to me was the argument connecting the intra-American slave trade to the commerce in British manufactured goods. In that part of the project, I tried to show how British slave traders exploited the slave trade for access to markets in Spanish America, where they sold not only people, but also manufactured goods, often illegally. The South Sea Company, for example, used Jamaica as its hub for the slave trade to Spanish America in order to have captives shipped from Africa converge in Jamaica with manufactured goods shipped from London. Then sloops shuttled mixed cargoes of people and goods from Jamaica to Spanish America, despite the Asiento contract only sanctioning the commerce in people. As one 18th century British strategist explained, quote, "A trade was opened with the Spaniards and successfully carried on for Negroes and other merchandise, whereby great quantities of the manufactures of Great Britain were yearly vended," end quote. And almost a century later, another British leader would describe the importance of the slave trade from Jamaica to Spanish America in very similar terms when defending the traffic from abolitionist critique, stating, quote, "A trade to the Spanish Main," meaning the Spanish American mainland, "for British manufactures is covered wholly by a few slaves, and the trade dependent altogether on that share in the assortment." In other words, selling manufactured goods was dependent on delivering enslaved people. This use of the slave trade to access markets for British manufactured goods, to my mind, changes the way we think about the profits of slave trading. It was about more than just the money made buying and selling another human being. The profits extended to some degree to other commerce that the slave trade allowed a trader to access. And because it was manufactured goods that these traders were selling, the connection breathes new life into Eric Williams' arguments connecting the slave trade to the profits of industrial production, with important implications for reparations debates in the present. Now, wait a minute, you might be thinking. The quotes I just gave you as evidence for this idea didn't come from port records or from a database. A database of slaving voyages doesn't show us how the slave trade was crucial to facilitating other commerce. So why am I telling you about this? The point I want to make in conclusions is that one of the things I find most useful about quantitative research is the generation of good questions, not answering questions, but raising them. When I started my dissertation research, I thought my project would be mostly about the slave trade between British colonies. It was a surprise to me to discover that human trafficking from the British Caribbean to French and Spanish colonies was actually far more extensive than the trade within the empire, and that the British government was very supportive of this practice. Why would the British, despite the Navigation Acts and the imperial race to colonize land in the Americas, why would they supply laborers to their imperial rivals? It was only in trying to answer that question that I hit upon one of the most productive lines of inquiry for my project. And on the face of it, there's nothing quantitative about the argument that the slave trade was used for access to sell manufactured goods. But the point I'm trying to make is that if I hadn't done the quantitative work to determine that British traders were selling hundreds of thousands of people from the British Caribbean to Spanish and French colonies, it never would have occurred to me to ask why they were doing it. So quantitative approaches cannot answer all questions, and numbers shouldn't be fetishized as the final word on a subject or as more important than other types of knowledge or information. But it also strikes me as unnecessarily dismissive of the significance of numbers to write off quantitative approaches as the numbers game, as critics of quantitative studies of the slave trade often have. It's disappointing to me that scholarship of the slave trade is quite divided over this issue of whether to use quantitative approaches or qualitative methods. I don't think we should choose. The archive is so limited and so biased toward European voices that I think we need all the methods we can dream up. I would like to see the field develop with more room to see different parts of the slave trade subfield, scholars applying different methodologies and types of sources as complementary, as working in concert with another, and to keep an eye on the fact that we have real enemies in the current political climate. There are plenty of people who don't want us studying slavery and the slave trade at all. So I don't think we should find enemies among people studying it from different methodological approaches. And I'll leave it there and hand it over to Alex.
Thank you, Greg. Could you stop sharing the screen? Yes. So I'm gonna go to talk about the behind the scenes of this project, to go also into the issue of potentials and limitations. When we were creating the Intra-American database in 2017 and 2018, we already realized that this was the beginning rather than the end, because through collaboration, we perceive many ways in which to increase coverage temporally, for instance, to the 19th century, as Greg's work and my work are more on the 18th century, and geographically to other areas. After the creation and the first publishing of this database in the Slave Voyages website, we applied for an ACLA's digital extension grant to support new work for 18 months, from the mid-2020 to the end of 2021. We started this project in the COVID era, which of course we didn't expect it, but this didn't prevent us to complete this phase by the early 2022, given the digital characteristics of the project. We thought about expanding the database in order to continue one of the potentials of these projects, learning through collaboration. We put together scholars who specialize in the United States, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Europe with each other, but also scholars at different stages in their careers, from grad school to tenure. These projects have the potential of developing new research teams because they can only be fulfilled by conductive collaborative research, in which learning takes place in all directions. This collaboration also involves librarians specialized in digital humanities and the larger public as well. The ACLS extension project incorporated the scholars at different stages in their careers, like Daniel Dominguez, who at that point was turning from assistant professor to associate professor at Rice in Houston, Jenny Williams, a finishing doctoral candidate at Johns Hopkins, for whom we created a postdoc funded by the ACLS in Santa Cruz, and graduate students and undergrads who work with us as well. For grad students, the ACLS funded 1 year free of teaching assistant duties, which is very, very significant for grads in public institutions like the University of California system, indeed. Greg worked as a mentor with Jenny because their scholarship was more closely connected. Jenny's work was about the internal traffic in the United States in the 19th century. During the tenure of the fellowship, Jenny added to the Intra-American database what we believe is one of the main branches of this traffic from the Chesapeake Bay to New Orleans between 1818 and 1860. They adapted the work of Jenny to add more than 3,000 slave voyages to the database, but also in a new section of the website called People of the Atlantic Slave Trade or Past, they adapted the work of Jenny about individual records of people to form a separate database called Oceans of Kinfolk, with more than 60,000 records. And I'm gonna just share briefly this new addition to the entire Slave Voyages website, which shows individual entries rather than entries of enslaved ships. And you see over here the different characteristics and variables for these individuals, and also a different kind of search engine over top here on identity, itinerary, and sources. Okay. Daniel Dominguez, on other part, on the Rice part, work on the IPEA database. What is this IPEA database? 2 decades ago, Brazilian historians funded by the Brazilian Center of Applied Economics put into digital format the individual records of enslaved men, women, and children sent from Rio de Janeiro to other Brazilian regions from the 1820s to the 1880s. Daniel and grad students at Rice adapted this data set to the Intra-American database. This is still ongoing, given the massive 19th century internal Brazilian slave trade. So far, they added almost 13,000 slave voyages within Brazil, carrying nearly 90,000 enslaved people from 1831 to 1860. But there is more to come, all the way from the 1860s to the 1880s, when Brazil became the last country to abolish slavery in the Americas. Daniel also used this ACLS project to encourage undergrad research on the history of Texas, where Rice is located. He noticed that Texas was nowhere in the database or in the entire website as well. And with this, he encouraged a group of honor undergrad students to work on records similar to those that Jenny Williams had worked for New Orleans, but for Galveston. And this led to new research and new entries on slave voyages arriving in Galveston in the 19th century from other ports in the United States, which will be featured in the Intra-American database in the near future. The incorporation of Texas to the geography of the database also shows the potential of the Intra-American database to show the capillarity of the traffic, the participation of ports in the Americas that previously were not listed or show in the maps that produce the website, like the map that Greg was showing to you in his part. This is not as simple as it sounds, because each place needs a new code in the database, and also we have to add the geolocation in the back end of the website in order to allow the production of maps that the interface produces from the user's searches. And note that there are some places in the Americas that we can locate. Or for instance, there are others that they have changed hands from one colonial power to another. Or from one independent nation to another independent nation, which makes difficult how to represent a space in a website covering almost 400 years of history of the Americas, Africa, and Europe. Talking about space, the prospect of incorporating the Black Pacific is a new challenge for us. While historians have chartered some of the slave routes connecting Panama with Peru and Mexico, as well as Chile with Lima, a new round of collaborative research is needed to provide more systematic views on how these coastal Pacific slave routes since the 16th to the 19th century work. In my part of the extension of the database last year, I worked with the UCA grad student Spencer Williams. I shall try name Spencer, he's gonna kill me. Spencer Gomez, to explore primary sources available online in the National Archives of Colombia. We also work with the newspaper Gaceta de México online, as well as with other sources provided by the Spanish historian José Luis Belmonte. The website of the Colombian National Archives has digital images of documents of a section named Blacks as Slaves, and I'm gonna just share with you what is the landing page of this section. Here I'm sending you to the National Archives in Colombia. This section was organized in the early 20th century with all kinds of documents related to the lives of Africans and their descendants in colonial New Granada, a larger jurisdictions that included today Colombia. In the early 21st centuries, these files were digitized. The catalog of these sections reproduced the cover title of the files involving everything from arrival of these vessels to rebellion and judicial litigations about freedom, literally everything. I'm not gonna start opening these things because, you know, internet is slow during Zoom communications, but at least I want to show you how is the kind of quality of the images shown by this process of digitalization. In this case, is a judicial litigation about the freedom of an enslaved person, indeed. I'm gonna stop sharing over here. Oh, here is stop sharing. Sometimes I get slow in these things. I read this catalog and selected files which seemingly had information about the traffic of captives. Spencer examined these files, and if information was there, he entered this data in the contributors interface of the Intra-American database. This could be data on slave voyages which already were in the database, but had only the departure from Jamaica or Curacao, and now we were adding the arrival in Cartagena. But also this provided information of Caribbean slave voyages to Cartagena that were not reflected neither in British nor Dutch sources. I want to emphasize that the database offers basic data about the forced itinerary of captives, from where they embark to the place of landing, the dates of these passages, and the basic characteristics about the enslaved, but not everything is there. If scholars and the public want to conduct research on specific voyages, they have to go to the sources cited in each of these records, in each of the units of the database. Sometimes these sources are scholarly books and articles, and sometimes these are archival primary sources, which now, after 2 decades of digital humanities projects, are increasingly available online. Take the example of what just I showed you from the Colombian archives, but also there are others as well. And I'm gonna go again to share screen. What you are seeing right now became available just probably 6 months ago or 9 months ago. This is the website of the Spanish State Archives called Pares, which has been around since the 1990s, by the way. But only recently, this website made available digitized records of 656 slave ship departures from the Iberian Peninsula, mostly during the 17th century, located in the Archivo General de Indias, or AGI, the Spanish archive of the Spanish Empire, located in Seville, which does not allow you to take your own digital pictures in the archive. This was unthought, impossible to think about it before it was there online. And then you can open and see the images over there. Or the National Archives in Madrid. I'm gonna change the tab. The website Pares recently put online 126 files of the clandestine slave arrivals in Cuba from the 1820s to the 1860s. This new availability of archival sources in digital formats encourage us in the future, not just to include the citation of the source in the source section of each slave voyage in the database, but also to provide a link to the users, to the archival sources themselves, or even to provide, if we can, pictures of the primary sources indeed. I'm gonna stop over here the sharing. As we talk about the expansion of the Intra-American database, we have to acknowledge also, and Greg says something about this, that the number of unknown slave voyages in the traffic within the Americas, for which we don't think a documentation exists, is surely larger than for the transatlantic traffic, for 2 reasons. One is the small scale and everyday contacts between neighboring ports, and another is the overland traffic. Let me give you an example from my region, the Rio de la Plata, what is today Argentina and Uruguay. While the transatlantic slave trade database shows the arrival of 100,000 captives direct from Africa to the Rio de la Plata, the Intra-American database shows additional 50,000 captives who were forced to embark in Brazil to sail to Buenos Aires and Montevideo. But in addition to this, we know multiple Portuguese, Spanish, French, and British sources attesting the existence of a very active traffic of captives to Buenos Aires from Colonia del Sacramento, located in the northern bank of the Rio de la Plata, the Plata River, in today's Uruguay, that's opposite to Buenos Aires, and a few hours of sailing between the two. Colonia was a Portuguese port city from the 1680s to 1777, almost for a century. Everyday contraband left very little voyage by voyage information on the traffic between Colonia and Buenos Aires. Yet, from multiple sources, as I estimate that an additional 50,000 captives arrived in Buenos Aires from Colonia, in voyages not documented by the Intra-American database. And there are other examples like this, like from Curaçao to Venezuela and across the Lesser Antilles in the Eastern Caribbean. And now another type of example about this, but from the place that I live in Southern California, which was part of colonial New Spain and so part of colonial Mexico. We hope to collaborate in the future to consolidate the massive work of Mexican historians on notarial records of slave sales, which shed new light on the movement of captives within colonial New Spain's overland, which is ranging all the way from Guatemala to the United States. So take into consideration that not all digital projects about the movement of enslaved people have to replicate the structure of the databases of the transatlantic and the intra-American traffic based on the voyage, of the slave voyage, as the unit of record. One of the challenges that we face for the future is how to represent this overland traffic. And we encourage new research that not necessarily fit with the structures of the already established databases, but can complement it and enhance it. I'm just going to raise two questions and 2 points to finish. The Intra-American, as well as the transatlantic database, aims to connect people and places, their histories, rather than completeness. I want to emphasize that the database of internal traffic in the Americas is not complete, and surely is less complete than the transatlantic database. Users and sometimes scholars think that these databases are complete, are all-encompassing and forever. And when they learn that they are not, this is their gotcha moment, like, aha, I found something that is not in the database, or an inconsistency, as if this is a mistake of those working to sustain these types of projects. Well, contrary to individualistic egos, we are very happy when somebody points that databases have errors, mistakes, inconsistencies, or misrepresent events, because all can be fixed, all can be improved, and there is a system to contribute data to these databases that are there, that is there in the website. To end, I want to emphasize one of the potentials of this project, which is our ability to expand what is there online, but also improving the way we present information about people and places, given that the perception of all these events change over time. This is the big difference between a project like this and a book. Once the book is published, it's out there and that's the end. But with online projects like the Intra-American Slave Trade Database, you have the potential of evolving through communication with audiences of scholars, students, and the general public. And we welcome and encourage this collaborative and productive dialogue. Muchas gracias, and that's it.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex and Greg. The floor is now open for questions. Any comments or questions?
I have one question for you guys. What you think? Some of you are involved on the Indian Ocean and South Africa. I was wondering if some of you are related to the construction of a database of the slave trade within the Indian Ocean.
That is a very apt question. Kerry, let's hear from you.
Okay, hi.
We can hear you.
We're just getting some feedback, so Hi, Alex and Greg. Nice to meet you. And I just want to, well, of course, I'm at Rice, and I am honored to be included in Daniel Dominguez's new, new project on trying to create a database on part of the Indian Ocean slave trade that connects to the transatlantic slave trade, which we know exists, but extending that further across to the patterns of the Indian Ocean slave trade. When I started my own research, I had hoped to do this research in the the early 90s, because I was excited by what was happening with with voyages, and I found it absolutely impossible to do as a singular project. And I had to really the quest, like you say, the absences create questions that sometimes can't be answered by individual scholars, as Greg was saying. So I had to change my research topic because it was too vast. So and as you all know, in the research on the Indian Ocean, even connecting to the Cape, the range of sources necessitates language expertise that spreads around various sites in the Indian Ocean that make it, as far as I know, there are no polyglots working in this field. So there's potential through the records that I know the best, the Dutch East India Company slave records that of course link various sites around the Indian Ocean for the 17th and 18th centuries, and then the British records later on. But it's a collaborative project, and it's a matter of kind of establishing some of the parameters of what we want to do, and then recruiting, because it's going to take, I think, a concerted, collaborative research team like you have had to really start gathering that data. And I think what it can do is use some of the pre-existing databases, like the Dutch East India Company shipping records that were created as that were quantified, but as you say, the information contained in those records is incomplete, but at least it gives us a guide of how to link voyages to a little bit more focused research on who was on those ships, rather than just tracing the ships. And I think, like Greg's work on combining the various forms of commerce with slave trading is important. And there was definitely in the Indian Ocean during the Dutch East India Company a speculative individual slave trade, that Dutch East India Company officials would buy slaves in various parts of what is now Indonesia, for example, knowing their value, get them cheap in the islands, and then sell them for a profit, get them on a ship and sell them at a profit at the Cape. And so there's also this kind of potential for looking at how this is not just linked to the companies themselves, but to individual speculators. And I think there was definitely a high degree of individual speculation trading in slaves in the Dutch East India Company period that hasn't really been looked at.
May I add something?
Was that Carla?
Yes, no, may I add something on this topic?
Oh yes, Stefania, by all means.
Yes, sorry. So in my little world, for my project, I am trying to trace the voyage. I'm working on Mauritius Island, and I'm looking at the slave trade through Mauritius. But as different from you, I really started looking at the boat itself. It was my interest, especially to look at the illegal slave trade through the lens of shipwrecks. So, but I completely agree with Carrie that it's really difficult because we have a different source, we have different actors that were playing in the Indian Ocean. What I am, for now I'm just looking at the database regarding shipwrecks. I'm not looking at the entire pictures. But because I am interested about the illegal slave trade, so I was digging on the archives in Mauritius, and I found, we can say, an internal slave trade, because it was during the illegal period, you couldn't trade anymore enslaved people. So what they come out is that they were taking, because Mauritius and Seychelles were under the same government, so they took people from Seychelles and to bring in Mauritius, but you need to have a particular permission. So I saw all this document that is in this archive of this huge book, where the owner of this sugar plantation in Mauritius could request to move its own slave from Seychelles to Mauritius, because he already was owning these people, so you could move them. But if in some case it was a real, with the form was filled with the real information, sometimes it was filled just with it's my own slaves. It seems that it was another way to trade illegally. So I'm trying to look at this information that I just found out a couple of months ago during my fieldwork. So it was interesting to see also this internal movement of people between islands.
That fits really well with our experience of some of the challenges of, because we basically adopted the voyage-based structure of keeping track of information that had already been used in the transatlantic slave trade database project. We really used all the same variables, and it was one of the things that allowed us to add our database to the existing slave voyages website, is that the functionality is all the same, because we used exactly the same variables. We named everything the same. Actually, that was one of the hardest things about getting it online, was getting the conformity perfect, because the programming, it's actually on the website, even though it's presented as two separate databases, it's all one database on the back end of the website. All of the voyages, transatlantic and intra-American, are in one big database on there, and there's just one variable that we use to differentiate the two. And so it's structured in that way. But one of the challenges of that, and it sounds like you're really running into that, Stefania, as well, is Alex and I often find in the intra-American traffic information that is not well suited to that one voyage at a time, where a voyage is the entry. So one place where I encountered it a lot was these voyages going from British colonies to French colonies. We know that that was happening on a significant scale in the, in the Eastern Caribbean, in the Lesser Antilles, going to places like Martinique and Guadeloupe from, Barbados or Antigua and other British colonies. But mostly we know that from, it was illegal in the eyes of the French in particular. And there's a lot of sort of government level correspondence that describes this rampant smuggling traffic and the failed efforts to stop it. But there are just these sort of general statements about the fact that this happens all the time, and year after year there continue to be these statements, or occasionally we'll have a merchant talking about how they participate in this, in letters or something like that, but nothing that allows us to sort of voyage by voyage say, okay, here's another one a month later, here's another one a month later, and create the kind of data that we have on the website. So we don't really know what to do with those kinds of more general statements. And I know Alex ran into those a lot for Venezuela. There's a lot of records, right, Alex? Weren't you telling me that that's a site in particular where there are a lot of these statements of X number of people have arrived over the last 10 years, mostly coming in from Curacao or something, but they don't sort of voyage by voyage log it in records that allow us to create entries. And so that's a real methodological challenge for us as well.
Thank you very much, Greg. I see Kerry's hand and then a question in the chat from Gerald. So shall we take those in that order, please?
I'd
Go ahead, Kerry.
Let's hear from Gerald first, because there might be some overlap, and I think Laura had her hand up. Okay.
Can I reply to the question of Gerald? When you mention only maritime records, there are records about everything in life in the database. There are records about judicial litigations, records about taxes that are levied years after the disembarkation of enslaved people. Sometimes there are records coming from information coming from parish records. It's not just what we would say port authorities. And with that, I would like to emphasize that people say, but of course, especially in the Spanish archives or the Spanish Empire, there must be a lot of contraband there that is not recorded. Where a lot of contraband within the Spanish Empire was recorded. And that sounds like an oxymoron. But actually, that's how the Spanish governmentability worked within colonial Latin America. There is not that much Spanish piracy, but there is a lot of Spanish contraband made by the Spaniards in a kind of resistance to metropolitan authorities. And there is a balance of power between the metropolis and the colonies on that end. And so there are recurrent ways in which to legalize contraband that leave a record in the archive, and they are not necessarily records regarding entries and exits of ships, indeed.
To refer specifically to the North American or U.S. part of this, in my own research, I really stopped at 1808. Because I was mostly interested in this issue of movements of African people after the Middle Passage as really a continuation of that same forced migration experience, that people had these series of moves. But in the database, we do have a fair bit of data now, and this is thanks to Jenny Williams, who Alex mentioned, who worked with me last year as a postdoc here at UCSC. After doing a wonderful dissertation on the domestic slave trade of the United States at Johns Hopkins. And she was very specifically focused on the maritime portion of it. And part of what she found was that perhaps a higher proportion of the domestic slave trade in the United States was maritime than previous scholars had thought, documenting voyages from the eastern seaboard around to New Orleans. And so we've got 3,000 such voyages now in the database, thanks to her work. She'll be at University of Virginia for the next 3 years on a postdoc now. In case anyone's trying to track her down, but there's a lot more to do because we have only done voyages to New Orleans. All of her data is focused on New Orleans. It's from many places along the eastern seaboard and some actually from elsewhere in the Gulf South, but it's all voyages into New Orleans. So there's more routes. Alex was talking about some of the work going on at Rice that undergraduate students there working with Daniel Dominguez are doing on voyages to Texas. Some of his students made the very astute observation that Texas doesn't appear, and yet we know slavery was important to its history. We also do want to work on the overland movements of people if we can find the right kind of records to create the sort of voyage-based entries. Otherwise, it's going to have to be some different kind of data set, because most of the work that's been done on the overland migration of people, at least on assessing the scale of that overland traffic, has been done using other kinds of methodologies, like looking at census records and doing the demographics of whole populations of counties and using that. Michael Tadman's work was terrific on that approach, but it doesn't have this voyage by voyage structure.
I would like to add to Greg that New Orleans was not just destination, but also reshipment of enslaved people all the way up to the Mississippi, let's say to St. Louis.
Kerry, would you like to raise your hand?
Yes, I did. Now, this comes out of my ignorance of databases, methodologies. But would it be possible to add a tag to the existing databases around the term contraband? even if it was created as something that, the databases would have to elaborate on as a definition, but to tag those entries that, because we all know that the illicit part, whether it was kind of winked at illicit or criminal, or however it was perceived by the states and the empires and the colonies, the legal systems. Would it be possible to do something like that with the existing data, and then have it as part of, Stefania's work looking at shipwrecks, and then recognizing that this is a huge question that the existing data would help us to understand if we could find it in there. So that's a question of ignorance, but
I will say yes and no. I will say yes in the sense that you can download the entire data set in an Excel version or an SPSS version and do that yourself or your students by, let's say, looking at the original records, the original record meaning like the primary sources or the books, and doing that as an exercise. Now, if you say that, oh, why don't you do that? Meaning Greg and I and the entire team of 20 people around this, I would say, because it's the issue of contraband for whom? Particularly when you have trans-imperial slave trade, something that is contraband for the Spanish was not for the English. And that's just a basic example.
Right.
Yeah, that was the first issue that sprung to my mind, is that it gets very tricky to define, because a lot of what I've found in the examples that I've looked at is the British government encouraging British traders to do this, while the Spanish government or French government is saying, no, this is illegal. You can't come in. But sometimes it can be the other way around. When the South Sea Company had the legal monopoly on the slave trade to Spanish America, the South Sea Company often complained that the Spanish government wasn't doing enough to crack down on other British traders outside of the company bringing enslaved people in violation of the company's monopoly. They were saying that the Spanish government was complicit in this traffic because they were always happy to bring in more people. So there's these levels, and then there's all these controversies, say within the French Empire, where sometimes the officials in France are saying you have to crack down, to officials in the colonies, you have to crack down on this illegal trade. And sometimes I'll see colony governors in Martinique or Guadeloupe writing back and saying, well, I know you want me to crack down on this illegal trafficking, but you also told me that you want me to promote the sugar industry and grow the colony. So I decided to let these voyages come in because we needed labor. The plantations were, sitting idle or things like that. And so then it's like, is it illegal or isn't it? Like, this governor is explaining why they made a legal exception to policy to the officials. It becomes really murky what's legal and what isn't in an environment like that. So it would be hard.
And by the way, there is an entire scholarship about multiple jurisdictions within colonial empires, and another one that's more like legal history, but also another one more on economic history of what is contraband.
Yes. Yeah, I know. It's a huge question, but it's so important. And the same thing in the Dutch East India Company records is that it becomes it changes over time for a start. And then from the macro, it changes over time, what is legal and what isn't, to the micro, individual feuds can result in people getting caught up in the legal system if the governor decides they don't like them anymore, and suddenly anything they're doing becomes illegal. So it can be it's very difficult, but the questions are so interesting. That's
okay. Thank you,
Stefania, for finding a way to kind of access. Shipwrecks are brilliant. That's a great idea.
Thank you very much. With time running out, we have a question from Gerald, and then Richard, and then Sada, and then we'll wind up. Okay. And we'll talk at the end about continuing the conversation. So fear not, if you don't get a chance right now. Okay. So Gerald. Gerald had a comment.
Yeah, but we already replied to that, I think.
Okay, fine, thanks.
Yeah.
Then Richard.
Well, I just want to follow up quickly on Kerry's issue about legal and illegal, but it also builds on what Greg was talking about earlier about the difference between the importation of labor and material, good products. Because that's so central to this notion about what the trade really consists of. But if you're thinking about this idea of, and this comes back down to what Kerry was pushing on, and that's the legal and illegal. So it comes back down to that big issue about smuggling. And one of the big concerns, of course, is the lack of clear ability to oversee the full range of commerce that's going on. And that comes back down to the fundamental critique that Intra-American raised to the database early on, which is how do we know what's going on if we can't record, if we don't see what is being left out? And I want to apologize to Alex that our internet here collapsed while he was talking about his ocean of kinfolk. And I would be really interested in going back over that particular thing when I get a chance to look at that portion of it, because one of the things that we're finding on the Senegal Liberation Project that we're working on is that groups of slaves are moving together seeking their freedom. And one of the things we want to do is to reconstruct what that is. And also in our data set, what we have is locations of where these former slaves were born. But one of the challenges we have is that many of these places no longer exist on maps. And so how do we go about finding out where they come from and tracing these routes? So we appreciate any advice you have.
Alex, do you want me to just say a couple things about the Oceans of Kinfolk data and where Jenny, okay. So I wonder, maybe I'll share my screen again to pull it up. Here we go. So this is data that ties to Jenny Williams' work, the postdoc who's here working with me, and basically it hinges on a unique feature of the slave trade within the United States after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade of 1808, as a way to try to ensure that smuggling of Africans from outside the country was not occurring under the cover of the domestic slave trade within the United States still being legal. Any of these maritime voyages within the United States from the eastern seaboard to New Orleans or along other routes had to register a manifest with the government listing all of the captives carried by name and with some other identifying information about them. So they feature in this People of the Atlantic Slave Trade portion of the website, which is brand new at the beginning of this year. And going into the database, if you go to this for the first time, it will actually give you a couple menus. Oh, it's actually, I'm using a different browser than I usually do. So it is asking me. So it'll pull up this menu. We've got this split into two parts. The African origins part is data that's actually been on the site for a while, but it's organized a slightly different way. This is people liberated off of captured slave ships in the abolition era, mostly ships taken into Sierra Leone by the British. The Oceans of Kinfolk data is a database, instead of being organized around voyages, it's organized around individuals. And it's all those people recorded on these ship manifests from the domestic slave trade in the United States. And this is also from Jenny Williams' research. And so what you end up with is a name and age. Disturbingly, there's this sort of a subjective racial descriptor that the port officials gave to each person on board, but then really interesting information about sometimes there's info about sort of where people were from. And as you can see, there's 63,000 people in here. So the potentials for genealogical research, in addition to historical research, is pretty powerful. So that's what's in that database.
Okay, Sada?
If I could make a quick plug.
Go ahead, Richard.
If I may just briefly make this quick plug for this workshop that we're organizing for October, which is on the ethics and methodology about naming of the names of enslaved people. And we welcome all of you to attend that one. We'll give you more information about that as it goes forward.
Thank you very much, Richard. I certainly hope that our Indian Ocean group can be part of that. So, and I hope others in this meeting as well. Sada?
Thank you so much, Grant. And thank you, Alex and Greg. This was a very interesting presentation. And although I'm not in that field, as an archaeologist of Africa, I'm very much interested in African peoples and African diaspora. And of course, my knowledge of this, the whole transatlantic slavery is very limited. But at UCL, and I am sure you know about this, there is a website, a database that came to my attention at the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery. And it was so interesting because they actually had the names of the people who were compensated for having lost their assets after the abolition of slavery. And you can go in and look at various names, and they also have maps, and mainly from Grenada, Britain itself, Barbados, and Jamaica. And now you have opened my mind to this whole complex part that I didn't know about, and the questions about legal and illegal, and the speculation trading, and the role of the slave trade in other markets. And this is all really fascinating. I'm wondering if there a way to pull somehow all these efforts and the work that Alex and Greg's doing, Carrie, Stefania, and others, and also others in various parts of the world, like in the UK, to somehow, maybe I'm being selfish, but to create for people like me who are interested in knowing this, a more kind of a big umbrella kind of a site where you could potentially look into various branches and databases and both qualitative and quantitative information. And also, I really like the beginning of Greg's introduction about how he went from trying to do a kind of a cultural study of the encounters to more creating basically a database and counting, and how also that potentially cultural element could still be somehow also achieved, or if there are others doing that. Sorry, this is a long, it's just my mind is literally opening up to this idea of how, in fact, we like people like me who are not in this field know so little about.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in on this first. I mean, one thing we definitely are interested in the slave voyages site, at least for the slave trade portion of this. It's a little hard to maybe team up with the other project you were describing, although we're definitely in dialogue with them. And in fact, Alex and I were on a conference panel with them just last week, where we were talking about both of these projects as working sort of along parallel tracks. But a big part of the reason that we added the Intra-American slave trade database to the Slave Voyages website rather than creating some new resource. I mean, selfishly for us, it made it a lot easier because there was functionality that overlapped between the two projects. But also we want it to be easy for researchers. You know, if you're interested in enslaved people arriving in Virginia, say, or in you know, what's now Argentina, you're probably interested in people arriving directly from Africa or from elsewhere in the Americas, right? And so that you can go to one website and see both of those in different databases. And there's actually a never-ending question in our minds about whether we should even have them separated or whether it should just be one user interface to search all of it. And there have been some attempts to get a grant. So far, we haven't gotten funding for it. I say we, I'm not directly involved, but for this Indian Ocean project, it would also exist on the same website to have an Indian Ocean slave trade database as a third, you know, parallel to these other two. And with similar kind of methodology. So I think along those lines that you're suggesting of kind of keeping this material together. And then I noticed Alex was throwing enslaved.org in the chat. Did you want to say something about what that?
Well, that's yeah, I know that's a project that was created, something of a gateway in order to put different digital projects together. It was created with the aim to, let's say, for databases to talk to each other, you know, to try to let's say, to identify either enslaved people with slave voyages or with other type of databases that look to notarial records or to other type of historical sources and digital humanities projects connected with the lives of the enslaved. And in that case, this is like a place where you can find different projects connected to different parts of the world and with different historical times. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
I have one question.
Very quickly, please. We're over time, so please be brief, Osgo.
Okay, I'll be brief. I just, it's about the nature of collaboration, because there are ongoing projects right now. So, for instance, Henry Lovejoy is doing something big, and I'm working on slavery in the Red Sea region, and I'm using Ottoman documents, Ottoman sources. So, and I was giving to him my sources because he wanted to put them in the website. And then a friend of mine just told me, but you didn't publish them, so don't put them there. So my question is, like, all the collaboration, and I don't know, I wanted to really, like, because he asked me and I didn't mind to share my documents, but on the other hand, I'm just still a PhD student. So, and I also wonder, how are you talking to each other? Because now Matthew Hopper, he's also doing like another project, Henry Lovejoy, you, and in this talk you have mentioned two others. So are you talking, are you in dialogue with each other? So yeah, thank you so much, it was great.
Well, Greg and I don't know in which language we talk to each other, because I don't know how he understands me. That's a mystery to me. But you are completely correct, Osgo, on the issue of how to share these documents. We have many times scholars that say, oh, I want to share this database, let's say, on Puerto Rico, but don't put that online right now because I'm writing on Puerto Rico. Wait for 3 years, and when my article is done, when my book is done, then you can move forward for the publication in the database. And in Greg's case and my case, we have our books and articles published before doing this type of things, which also tells you that it would have been impossible for us to publish new books while doing the same thing at the same time. So that's the other part as well. So there is also an ethics about the collaboration on these things, and also between the inequalities between what happened here in the United States and in other places in Latin America, Africa, and Asia or the Middle East regarding the access to the archives and the resources to access of the archives.
Thank you very much. I hate to be the killjoy, but we are over time on a very full day. It remains to thank Alex and Greg very, very warmly indeed. Not only have you given us very stimulating and clear presentations, but you've encouraged us to seek links, to reflect on precisely the methodology, on the questions, on the pragmatics that we all have to deal with in some degree or another. These are encouraging, they're also troubling. There's much more to discuss. And in fact, to criticize our own project, we've presented audiences with a rich discussion. There are many, many more links for us to explore together. So though this academic year is at an end, I really do hope we can find some way to convene in the next academic year to push comparison, to push the question of methodologies further on the basis of the kind of wonderful work that you've given us, not only in your web and your print publications, but in your presentation today. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you everyone for coming along.
Thank you very much. I want to just give a particular big thank you to Professor Grant Parker to give me this opportunity to be involved in the series. Really, thank you, Grant.
Thank you, Stefania. And if you're on Stanford campus tomorrow, 3 to 5 p.m. at the Stanford Archaeology Center, Dr. Sada Amira is the keynote speaker for a student curated exhibit on the African collections. I've heard about this for many, many months, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what the students have come up with and what Sada says about it. Thank you very much, everyone. And goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.